Hello, friends. I'm Brian Shircliff with Vitality Buzz, Bliss, and Books, here to buzz with you for a few moments because a few friends suggested that I kind of explain who in the world is Brian Shircliff to tell us about the Bible, and especially to tell the world that large swaths of the Bible are LGBTQ plus friendly, that large swaths even point to Yahweh as a same-sex lover. Imagine that. And that even the imagination in these sections that nobody reads, all right, I'll say more about that, just might be just what the world needs and what humans need on this planet to continue to live on the planet. And I'll have a lot to say about that too. So just to say, some people have even said, well, Brian, you're just reading your story, your own sexuality and your own identity onto the stories of the Bible. But I can guarantee that I'm not, especially if you look at the verbs of the Hebrew text, which are wild, in which one scholar has dealt with. The other scholars just kind of bypass it. And I'll have more to say about that too. But I'd like to talk about my own life in terms of 9 key experiences, 9 key moments, you might say, in my life that have shaped my own view of the Bible. And moment number 1 is quite amusing. It takes me back to when I was, I think, 5, maybe 6, probably 6. And my parents took me downtown to visit Pitter and Patter at Christmas. They were I think Santa's reindeer or something like that in one of the department stores that died out probably very shortly after that. And I stood there before the world, many people, and they said, "Oh, you little boy," in these cute little overalls that my mom had made for me. And what do you want for Christmas? I said, I want a Bible, I want slippers, and I want a robe, with my little hands behind my back. There's even a picture of that, I think, in my family heirlooms. And here's this little boy asking for a Bible and slippers and robes. I think I was an old man before I was a boy. Kind of a wild thought. And what do you know? I got that Bible. And why did I want the Bible? My family wasn't particularly religious. We'd go to church on Sundays and holidays, and we'd say grace at meals. But what was it? Well, I was in CCD, or had been, Sunday mornings while my mom went to Mass at the local parish. I went to CCD and we did drawings and all this. And I can remember where it was in the room. Ended up being my 7th and 8th grade classroom when I went to school at St. Ignatius grade school on the west side of Cincinnati. But I remember where I was in the classroom when the teacher said, whoever was leading this, I think they might have been even high school students, said the Bible is full of some wild stories. You should read them. And being a pretty inquisitive little boy, I decided I wanted to read them. I wanted to see what these things were about. And so I got my Bible from Pitter and Patter, whoever it was that gave it to me, the children's Bible. And I would sit in my family living room while my mom was making dinner and read it, or at least look at the pictures until I could read it. And somebody must have told me, maybe it was a kid in the youth group that was leading our CCD classes, that the pictures weren't accurate. The pictures weren't accurate. These people were not white people. Here's the serpent in the Garden of Eden story, the Eden story. Eden means pleasure, by the way. And you remember this older student in our class saying that the people were darker skinned. They were from a place in the world. The stories emerged from a place in the world where people were not white. And I suddenly realized, oh, they're like my neighbors. They might be like my neighbors who were from Pakistan. And at least that would have been closer. So I started imagining these people to look that way. I noticed I even had this page marked. I think is quite funny. But look at even the sultry poses of the characters. This is Jacob, where he's having his wild dream about Yahweh being at the top of the staircase. And eventually someday Jacob will wrestle this Yahweh in a very sexy way if people actually read the verbs as they're there. So there it is. There's moment number one, pitter and patter, me getting my first Bible. And then moment number two is 6th grade in Mrs. Cook's class. We actually read the adult Bible. So not the children's version. We read the New American Version. And it was something else to read what was there, because she let us read the real text. And I think that's the first time we had done that, at least in large chunks. Like we read it, like you don't read the Bible from beginning to end if you're a sensible person. The stories are not laid out that way as a continuous, what I call the strand, continuous ongoing story. You have to jump to certain places to keep reading the continuing ongoing story, because there's a lot of commentary stuffed in there, and even the organization of the books doesn't lend itself to that kind of reading. So we were reading this adult Bible, and I was shocked what was in there, because I thought it was actually better than Star Wars, and Star Wars ruled the day. There's a funny story about me going to see Star Wars with my dad, and save that for another day. But Return of the Jedi had come out 2 or 3 years before I had started reading the Bible, and that ruled our imagination. And here I am reading these stories about David and thinking, goodness, this is almost as good, if not better. This little 6th grader realizing that and finding something there that I thought was important. And it shocked me. It also shocked me just how violent the biblical stories were, and full of sex, outright sex. I mean, here's a 6th grader reading this and kind of going, what? Like, we didn't necessarily talk about it so much in class, at least not those passages, but I was a little bit shocked that the prayers that we were being taught and the morality we were being taught didn't match up with what the biblical characters were doing and saying and acting and all that. And no adult could give me a good reason about that. I mean, sure, it could be like, okay, look what happened to this character. You don't want to live like that. Sure, but David does some pretty awful things, and he's lifted up as the greatest one ever, the greatest king ever. It's kind of interesting. So moment two, 6th grade classroom. Fast forward, moment three, I was a freshman in high school in Mr. Cronin's class, where we read the full strand of the scriptures, from the beginning of the story in Genesis all the way through, I suppose, the supposed end of the story, Acts of the Apostles and Revelation, Mr. Cronin's favorite. And this was the second time I had a chance to really read, and I think we read more than we did when I was in 6th grade, I'm sure of that. But to begin to read that story again and start to realize, there's stuff in this Bible we don't read in church, because the lectionary cycle of at least the Catholic Church and many, many churches doesn't read much. The lectionary includes very little of the Bible. I think it's like 15% of the Hebrew Bible shows up in the Catholic lectionary. And that includes weekdays. And most people don't even read the weekday readings. So little of it is there. And so here I am reading it for the second time, at least with a circle of people that wanted to read with me and talk about it and be led by this very wise Mr. Cronin. And I was shocked that these things, again, were there in this Bible. And what does this mean? And there's some whacked out things happening here. And to realize too that these stories it's like an ongoing conversation of 1,000 years of people trying to make sense of their lives through a story, often told around a campfire, trying to make sense of life. And that sometimes these stories disagreed with each other. Matter of fact, often in the Bible, the stories disagree with each other. And, Mr. Cronin wasn't afraid to help us realize that, that was an important realization, that you cannot read the Bible literally, at least the whole thing, because there are places that purposely disagree with each other. One camp has this version of this idea, another camp has this idea of the way life should be. And even another camp might have a completely different vision for the way life should be. And it was the first time that Mr. Cronin really invited us. He was the first teacher I had that really invited us, to have a critical eye to what Jesus was saying, to really sit with a saying for a while and puzzle with it, not just move on to the next one. And I really appreciated that. Became very formative for me. And meanwhile, while I was in high school, we read a little bit more of the scriptures here and there, not the full strand as we did freshman year with Mr. Cronin, or what I call the full strand, or most of it anyway. But I was having other teachers that were giving me deepened experiences of meditation of so many sorts. Mr. Eby, Mr. Stegman, just to name a few. And those experiences shaped me quite a bit. And it's made me start to wonder, well, what in the world was Jesus doing out in the desert? Was it kind of like this meditation and these prophets that are out in the desert? And eventually later, the desert fathers and mothers that we learned about. Is this what they were experiencing? Rather wild idea. And I should say, too, that my youth group leaders, this youth group must have been something else, huh? I usually skipped it, just to tell the truth. My buddies and I would go hang out on the picnic tables outside and hide from the leaders. But the few times that I did go in when I was in junior high, they led us in meditation. They would have us lie down on the gym floor, cold gym floor, and lead us in a meditation. It was a wild experience. So all these experiences percolating, waking me up to reality, a possibility, a new way of seeing, right? And then moment 4, I was a freshman at Xavier University, and I had Sister Ruth Graff, the famous Sister Ruth, who I think was the first woman or second woman to graduate from Hebrew Union. And she invited us to read the strand, but she skipped Genesis. She didn't have any care in the world for Genesis, which I thought was fascinating, considering I've spent a lot of time with Genesis since then. But she started with the Exodus story, and we read the Hebrew Bible through with a deep look at the prophets, which was maybe the first time I really sat, just as Mr. Cronin invited this deep reading of Jesus's sayings, Sister Ruth really helped us to begin to have a deep reading of the prophets, which was her expertise. She's known for that. And to realize that these prophets were essentially composing poems to deal with the reality, the very, very scary reality of war, of being conquered, of kings holding people back, of all these things, of people getting caught up in sex cults, the fertility cults of Baal and Ashtaroth. That was fascinating, that these prophets were just composing poems, raps essentially, right? Not writing them down, just speaking them out loud with these clever ideas and these clever turns of phrase that Sister Ruth would point out to us every now and then in the Hebrew. We didn't know in Hebrew at that point. She did. She was reading the Hebrew Bible, every morning. Sometimes she'd do that instead of read the translation we'd read, and she'd have to ask us, what does your translation say? Which was fascinating to me. Like, oh my gosh, you can get so good at reading the Hebrew Bible. Well, I want to be like that. I want to be like that. But it was in reading these prophets' poems that I started to realize, this is very much like Martin Luther King, whom we'd studied quite a bit when I was a student at St. X High School, through these excellent teachers, Mr. Stegman in particular, helping us to read some of his speeches or hear some of his speeches. And I thought, these poems are very clever. These prophets' poems, the Bible, are very clever. They're like Gandhi's little twists of phrase, his little turns of phrase. And come to find out later on, it was Gandhi's reading of the Bible that inspired much of his vision for nonviolence. He was able to see that in the Bible, whereas most of my Christian friends, many of my teachers even over the years, could not recognize that the roots of nonviolence as practiced by so many, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, on and on and on, were biblically rooted. That's fascinating to me. In that Gandhi was the one to be able to see it first, to recognize these raps and these clever stories as ways to open someone's imagination to another way, a way that does not include violence, a way that recognizes the equality that exists between people, that exists among all people, and that love perhaps is a way to work with these violent impulses. Seems like a wild idea, doesn't it? So as I continued on with Sister Ruth and at Xavier University, I got the urge to study Greek. I studied Attic Greek for 2 years, which is the tough Greek, and decided then to continue on with Koine, which is biblical Greek, which is a lot easier, I must say. But it really shaped me to read early Greek texts that were much more challenging than the Koine, biblical Greek, that helped me to kind of understand this larger way of communicating, I would say. And it was also at Xavier that I met the person who's probably the most formative person in my life, biblically speaking, Art Dewey. And I didn't meet him as my professor first. I met him as a fellow student. We were taking a math logic class with Dr. Larkin. It's a very small group of us, 5 brave souls that were going to try out Dr. Larkin's new math logic system. And Art Dewey, I don't know how old he was then, maybe he's about my age now, was sitting there in the class with us. And that I was like, somebody knew him. A couple, actually, I think most of the class was theology majors, believe it or not, taking this math logic class and trying to figure out what in the world Dr. Larkin was doing. The first few days were very fun and easy. The last few days, I have no idea what was going on. And most people didn't. It was that complicated and wonderful. And Art Dewey was there doing the same thing with us. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And just got to know him as a person through his questions and his laughter in the class, like how clever the system was and complicated and just fun. So I started taking classes with him. I certainly was interested in scripture, started to realize I was an English major at the time, but started to realize that the better stories that I could find anywhere were in the Bible if we spent time reading them. And I wasn't getting those readings in the lectionary cycle in my church experiences. But if we read that strand, that ongoing strand of the story, oh my gosh, there's some clever stuff there. So I took many, many classes with Art Dewey, and with my, fledgling Greek background, was beginning to read many of these texts in the Greek, many of these New Testament texts, the Christian scriptures text in the Greek with other students and having conversations. And that was profound for me. Profound. So I started spending more and realizing that was valuable. And here I was an undergraduate doing this. I took a couple graduate classes, and they were not nearly as challenging or interesting as the undergrad classes I was taking with fellow Greek readers who were reading these texts in their original language. That was fascinating to me. And Art, really helped me in 2 very particular ways. He did what Mr. Cronin did, is he invited me to begin to see these sayings as something pivotal, and as perhaps these sayings of Jesus, I should say, as something even standing, perhaps even opposed to the gospel, the so-called gospel stories. So like, as we would say, the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Mark, and then even the Gospels that didn't make the canon of the Bible, that these sayings of Jesus maybe were not understood by the gospel writers. But if we sat with them for a while and wondered about them in their context, in the world in which Jesus was living, that something opened up about them. And Art was running at that time. He was in the Jesus Seminar, still is. I don't know if they meet anymore, actually. They're still doing some publishing, though. And it was a very controversial class. I mean, I had Christian friends said, oh, don't go take that class. They're doing very bad things, which intrigued me because I knew and trusted Art and knew that he had a profound interest in the sayings of Jesus that most of my Christian friends didn't, which kind of bothered me, to say the least. I would bring that up in class, and teachers didn't want to hear that either. But, I thought I found these sayings that they were so profound that I would sit there for days reading them. And I thought, reading them and wondering about them. and talking about them with classmates in these small little seminars of very bright people that Xavier drew together. Kind of amazing, the experience that we had. I would challenge it against any Ivy League education at that point. Matter of fact, I had friends that went to the Ivies and they didn't get what we got. That's for sure, as we compared notes. And we were able to study with some just amazing people, amazing scholars. But I was struck that why is this Jesus seminar so controversial? They are actually doing something with the sayings of Jesus, whereas a lot of scholars didn't even want to touch them. They'd rather talk about Jesus the Christ, whatever in the world that is. So I had a profound experience there with Art, and Art taught me also, probably most importantly in that Jesus seminar class, how to frame an argument and how to support your argument as best you could, make your argument, hear rebuttals, hear other ideas, and then start to realize that you might have to change your argument based on the facts, based on what other people offer, based on other people's questions. So early on, I got this kind of academic grounding in learning to frame an argument the best I could, but then also the flexibility to kind of wonder, I might not be right? Or what I think now might be different if I get a little bit more information. And that was profound. I remember Art, I even put it in quotes, I made some notes here, make your best case with support. I remember him saying that dozens of times, and how important that was and is for me. It was at this time too that I was just studying the library, and I found in the garbage can a copy of Walter Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination, which another class was reading. We didn't read it with Ruth when I was going through with Ruth. I think she might have read it in another class that I didn't take with her. And found in the garbage can this skinny little book, and it looked like it hadn't been read. The binding was still in pretty good shape. It has since fallen apart. And I was fascinated by this Brueggemann guy and how he framed his argument that there's a different imagination that the prophets offer, and thought, And I found that what I was learning about Jesus' sayings seemed to enter right into that the prophets and Jesus were on to something similarly. And I thought that was rather interesting. So the other thing that's interesting too is that when Ruth was having us read the prophets, she was having us sit down with the whole book and read it through, and then begin to look at certain passages and realize, oh, well, this wasn't all said in one swath, one saying, right? This is over many, many years, for instance, with Jeremiah, or perhaps with Isaiah, to realize that the book of Isaiah, what we call the book of Isaiah, or the scroll of Isaiah, is actually 3 different authors. Now that's common knowledge these days, common knowledge among scholars anyway, that 3 different people were writing at 3 different times, and all of their poems seem to be similar, and so they were all wrapped up in one scroll. And one of those writers, one of those prophets, is probably a woman, right? Second Isaiah. Maybe that's why she didn't get her own scroll, her own book, because she was a woman prophet. And there's a lot of that in the Bible. There's a lot of that holding women down. And yet, it's the women, if we read carefully, who are the wise ones in the Bible. More on that later. One other thing I started to realize too, that this Bible is way more complex than I thought in terms of how it was put together. That not only were there 3 authors to the book of Isaiah, 3 separate poets, writers, and that Jeremiah's poems were cobbled together by this scribe, Baruch, probably long after Jeremiah was dead, maybe during his life. But it was profound to start to realize that this Jeremiah was so controversial that his own country people killed him, just like the people of my own country killed Martin Luther King, or the people of Gandhi's country, one of his own countrymen killed him, for his clever turns of phrase, for his awakening people to what could be instead of what always has been. And that was profound for me, and that this happened to Jesus too. And here were these gospel writers cobbling together different things to try to invite a perspective about this Jesus. And these perspectives don't necessarily agree. The four canonical gospels are very different from each other, and that they were cobbled together in interesting ways. For instance, like the Gospel of Matthew is kind of has the story of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, with some brushed up grammar and diction. Mark's language is kind of, I don't know, like sixth grade writing, maybe. Matthew's is much more refined. And so Matthew heard or read this Gospel of Mark and brought it forward in his own language, added some sayings of Jesus and some other stories. That's this layer that is very similar to what's in Luke, though the languaging is different, often very different. So scholars argue that there is another source that they call Q, which actually is a word for source in another language, and or the first letter of that word anyway. And that Matthew not only used Mark and Q, but also had some special material, and that Matthew brought his own perspective to interpreting what Jesus was after, and sometimes seems to kind of hit it on the head, and other times seems to be taking Jesus, almost putting words in Jesus's mouth. And that shocked me. That shocked me that could happen. And then near the end of my time at Xavier, getting ready to sign up for my final classes, Ruth grabbed my hand. She was my advisor. And she said, we're going to go to the chair of the department and to the dean, and we're going to get you out of this class that you have to take to graduate so that you can go study Hebrew. Because I'd been bugging her that she would teach me Hebrew for a couple of years now. And she said, I'm not going to do it, but I know Tim Shear, a fellow graduate of Hebrew Union, who's teaching at the Athenaeum. He's going to teach you Hebrew, and we're going to get you out of this required class, and you got plenty of other credits to make up for that, and we're going to go get it done. And just who happened to be the chair of the department, but Art Dewey. And he's like, oh goodness. Yeah, okay, well, let's make an effort at this. And he thought it was an uphill battle, but the dean signed off on it. And I was able to study Hebrew at the Athenaeum, and it was amazing. And it was difficult. Hebrew was way harder than Greek. I couldn't understand what in the world was going on with the verbs. And for our final exam, Father Shear had us translate the book of Jonah, which is short and sweet, or as much of it as we possibly could, and just to leave blanks, in the translation for the places where we got caught, we couldn't make sense of things. Mine had a lot of blank spaces. I didn't understand this Hebrew at all, or very little anyway. But I was intrigued enough by it to realize, what we were reading in a translation in church doesn't often match what's there in Hebrew, just as some of the translations of Jesus' sayings don't come through real well in English. You have to use a lot more cleverness to bring forward those clever words than what usually shows up in most translated Bibles, most Bibles translated into English. So I'm very grateful that Ruth grabbed my hand and we went to Art Dewey and the dean and got that done. And I got a little intro to Hebrew that I continued on with. Moment 5, I applied to a famous doctoral program and got turned down to study a doctoral program to study scripture. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I'll say more, because after I was turned down, I'd also quit another job that I was in. I was a community organizer for a little group called Interparish Ministry. And it's another story for another day, but I quit that job and got a rejection letter from this doctoral program and didn't know what I was going to do. And a friend of mine, I think it was actually Good Friday, and I had gone to church hoping for some wisdom. And one of my former teachers, Mike Marshall, said, hey, there are openings at the high school, St. Xavier High School where I'd gone. Why don't you just apply to teach over there? You want to be a teacher someday. And I thought I was going to be a college teacher. And I went and applied and taught there for 17 years. And it was the greatest gift ever, that rejection letter. I don't know if I even still have it anymore. Maybe I should frame it, because that oftentimes with doctoral programs, and a number of my teachers had pointed this out to me, you are forced to choose a very small little wedge to get to know very well. And instead of holding the whole text of the Bible, or that strand, as I call it. And I was very interested in the strand. And what did I get to do as a high school religion teacher, but work with that strand every year. So for 17 years, 17 times through, 16 times at St. X, once at St. Ursula Academy, I had a chance to read with freshman students that strand. And they even realized very quickly, my goodness, many of them were active churchgoers, and so many of them said, why don't we read any of this in church? None of my family know any of these stories, and we're devoted Catholics or Jews, or we go to this church or that church or whatever. They were fascinated, just like I was, because as I said before, the lectionary covers the Catholic lectionary covers 15% of the Hebrew Bible, and I think it's about 75%. So a good chunk of the New Testament is actually heard if you were to read the readings for weekdays and Sundays, weekdays and Saturdays and Sundays, which most people don't do. Most people just hear the Sunday cycle, and that's even smaller chunks of the Bible. So, for instance, when's the last time you sat down and read Genesis from beginning to end? It's a hard read. It's a very difficult read because there are multiple authors there trying to get their voice in, and all of them arranged by an editor who has a definite dislike for one of the writers. But that writer was so popular that these priestly editors had to include her, who we call Jay, another person who most, or at least many scholars, think was a woman. I'm sold on that idea. I've made my best argument in A Wildly Sensual Yahweh about that this is a woman, and in my earlier Sweet Lady J translations. More on that later. And when's the last time you sat down and read 1 and 2 Samuel, which some consider the best saga ever written? And to think what that's about. When's the last time you sat down to read an entire gospel? Doesn't matter even which one, and to realize what's there and what's not there, within that particular gospel. Or to sit down and read like one of Paul's exceedingly clever letters, like even a good translation of Paul's letter to the Romans is, it's fascinating to sit with one of these large swaths of text, one of these big chunks of that strand, and be with it for a while. It doesn't match the tiny little chunks that we get in most church worship, at least in the Christian tradition. So as a religion teacher, high school religion teacher, I got to talk with freshmen through seniors about these stories every day. And no matter their background, or because of their background, they brought their background, thankfully, it invited them to ask very challenging questions of the text and of our circle of understanders, and to realize that these texts really do not belong to any of these three traditions, that they are pre-tradition in a sense, and therefore kind of free to contradict what we understand in the 20th and 21st centuries when I was teaching. Which is a fascinating thing, right? And I had a chance to chat with amazing colleagues about these stories during free periods and such. And we'd get together and just kind of wonder about certain things and share resources. And like, oh, have you read so-and-so's book about this? So you might be interested in this. Just amazing experiences that I was able to have as a high school teacher. And the brilliant questions that students brought. And often, to think that 5 times a day, 180 days of the year, and 17 years of this, I was able to hear these different perspectives and wonder in all these different ways, which I could have never gotten in graduate school. Sadly, I wonder if I could have even gotten with college students. Something about that being together for a year instead of just a semester, the year to follow the entire strand. this incredible gift that opened me to what's there and what's possible. And also to begin to wonder even more about those experiences of these people that were writing these stories, right? It wasn't, they just didn't come out of nowhere, right? They were having experiences in their very natural settings. As I often point out, their world and the ancient world, so different from us. Can you imagine a world without air conditioning? You know, that alone. Can you imagine a world without these computers? Can you imagine a world without automobiles, you know, on and on, planes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? How they were living, they were in the midst of feeling the wind, you know, of hearing the crackle of the fire, not just once a year at some campfire they go to in their neighborhood, you know, but every night perhaps, you know, of, you know, touching the earth, of being near animals, of being near life in this very different way, of touching, of depending on water, seeking out water, and not just going in the kitchen and turning on a faucet, right? This is a very different world. And I started wondering about all these experiences and crafted a meditation class for seniors that began to wonder about, you know, experiences of the wind, of breath, of spirit. Those are all the same word in Hebrew and in Greek for that matter. So to begin to wonder about that. So moment 6, I finally got to meet Walter Brueggemann, thanks to the Green family. I met him a couple times, but one time in particular over dinner with the Greens, and very grateful for that. And got a chance to hear this great scholar who moved to Cincinnati for his wife's job, thankfully. Thankfully, she had a job here in Cincinnati for a good, nice stint of time. And to be able to hear him offer these free workshops all over town, often for a number of years, around 2010. It's about the same time we were founding Vitality. And the gift of hearing this guy, this wonderful human being, speak about these things, these poems that he said that he'd been studying for decades. And it was an eye-opening time, to say the least. It was also the same time that I actually, I'd taken a year off from teaching to get Vitality started, and I had to take a class to keep my high school religious ed certification going, and took a class on Paul with Art Dewey, and met some wonderful friends there and helped us found Vitality. And this profound year of 2010. And during one of Brueggemann's talks, we had to change rooms or something. It was at a monastery in Kentucky. And I remember I had a chance just to walk along with him for a second. And I said, hey, I'm studying Hebrew. And I studied a long time ago. I have an interest in continuing. I'd been poking around with it over a little bit over the years. And I said, what do you think I need to know if I want to get good at this language? And he said, oh, you can learn the nouns and the adjectives in an afternoon. No problem. He said, the verbs, that's going to take you your entire lifetime. And I was watching this man, you know, each time he was with us giving these lectures, watching him come to some amazing fruition with these very challenging verbs that do playful, wild things. And I'm very grateful for what he offered about that, about the need to continue to study the verbs, which sadly, I think many scholars do not do. As I read their writings about the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, it seems to me that they haven't continued studying the verbs, but Brueggemann did, and I'm grateful for that. And I should say too, that Art Dewey had crafted this amazing authentic letters of Paul that he and his scholar friends, Roy Hoover, Lane McGowie, and Daryl Schmidt had spent 20 years translating the letters of Paul. And Dewey was putting together this class to offer their findings. And we were reading, it wasn't even out yet, we were reading the pre-publication copies, trying to help him catch typos and stuff like that too, which is kind of fun. And I would sit there, I was never a fan of Paul. Matter of fact, I was put off by it, but reading this translation of the authentic letters where they were able to kind of listen to the voice and realize when Paul was being edited over, just as Jesus was edited over, just as Sweet Lady J, that's that first writer of the Bible in Genesis, was edited over, to be able to read these letters of Paul without those intrusions in the text. I would weep. I remember sitting in Xavier's new edition of the library and weeping out of joy and beauty at this guy's argument, and starting to realize that, why don't people talk about these things? Paul is the first imaginer of democracy without slaves. Paul is the first imaginer of democracy with women and men co-leading, as co-equals in leading communities, circles of friends beginning to wonder about this Jesus, and to wonder about a new way forward that isn't the Roman Empire. Rome was essentially, and their system of hierarchy was madness. I'm still shocked that people look to Rome as an example that we should emulate. It's a torturous society. And maybe the reason we want to emulate it today is because we're doing just that in the United States, in my home country. It's time for us to wake up. Very much so. And, sometimes it was at this time too, studying letters of Paul, that a group had been doing work with Acts of the Apostles, and they'd released their findings that essentially said that Acts of the Apostles was a fiction that was designed to try to make Peter look better than Paul, and that Paul is reduced, and even the cleverness of his letters is not there in Acts of the Apostles, and Peter is boosted up as this great leader. But he's this great leader that has the same imagination as Rome, this hierarchical imagination, whereas Paul, and hierarchical imagination just means you think you're better than some people. Some people, you got to do this and this and this to be here. And if you don't do those things, then you're here. And that some people are better than others. And Paul has this vision where it's a circle of deciders. It's not led by somebody who is better, some special person. It's led, the group is led. Yeah, you need leadership within groups, right? People that take care of things, but it's not based on, the recognition that that person is better than me, and that I'm worse in some way. It's leadership by sharing authority within a circle. That's what Paul was imagining. And that Paul lost, right? As Dewey's fond of saying, Paul lost his argument, right? What form of Christianity emerged? Form of Jesus believing emerged, but Peter's hierarchical imagination, which is killing us all over again these days, and we can't even recognize it. And that's what's shocking to me. But if we're careful, we start to actually read these texts and wonder about them, and read more than just the lectionary cycle, we might begin to wake up. We might begin to wake up first that there's another way, another imagination, one that is not hierarchical, one that is more circular, one that recognizes that only Yahweh is above any other human being, no human being above any other. And in Paul's imagination, not even Jesus, that even Jesus bows before Yahweh. That's a wild idea. And that Paul's letters could be listened to in this new way was profound to me, at this time. Moment 7, I got to do a lot of travel as a high school teacher with some free time, and then especially after I left behind teaching and coaching, I started doing quite a bit of travel. And first travel was significant travel was to Italy with Jillian Ogren and Art Dewey to try to craft a new version, like a spiritual exercises for the 20th and 21st century. Actually, it was 21st century. We're in the 21st century then. And because Ignatius's spiritual exercises were written, 500 years ago. 500 years plus ago. So is there a way to bring it forward in a new idea? So we hunkered down in a little albergo in Italy, and these people, friends of ours, make this wonderful food, and we would meet twice a day for breakfast, a long breakfast of a couple hours and a long dinner of a couple hours, and talk. about ideas. And the middle of the day was free for our own writing and own pursuits. And I did a bunch of writing, eventually became the big sections of that new setting of Ignatius' spiritual exercises that we wrote at Vitality with Vitality, a circle of friends there. And I also had a few extra hours that I would spend studying Hebrew. I hunkered down and started at the very beginning with that same text that Father Shear had us using. And I went back and started all over again, made my little flashcards, did all the exercises, went back and graded those exercises myself, and felt this awakening within me. I was starting to get it. I could pick up the Hebrew text, say of Genesis, and I could read it. And I thought, this is starting to get interesting. And I made my first best guess about what I was reading in Genesis, this author, this J, and published Sweet Lady J, shortly after that new setting of Ignatius' spiritual exercises. And I also had a chance to travel. I should say, though, first that I did another reading of that Genesis text and started to realize I missed things. My previous argument needed improvement. So I came out with a new edition of Sweet Lady J. And then I tell you more about that later, read it again and realized that I'd missed even more. And that's how this came about, Wildly Sensual Yahweh. So making one's best guess continues to change, continues to improve. And I also, during this moment 7, some more travel, got a chance to, became intrigued by, and there's another video about this, and I'll save that for that video, but naturist places, nude beaches, where you can feel the wind on your skin, where people don't have the same inhibitions that many in the US have, that I had, that was, I think, destroying my life. Those were profound experiences, and starting to realize that it seemed to match what I was noticing the prophets were writing about regarding Yahweh. If you read Yahweh as the wind, which especially they do in 1 Samuel, that Yahweh being the wind, and in Sweet Lady J's stories and J's stories in Genesis. And that it bothered me too that, and it took me a while to kind of finally get my mind around this, that the word for prophet in Hebrew, nabi, is the word for ecstasy and ecstatic, someone who shakes with their experience of the wind, the spirit. Why wasn't that ever talked about in church? I was shocked by that. So these travels helped me to wake up to certain things. Moment 8, I had, after publishing Sweet Lady J, I started getting really curious about the writings of the prophets, and wanted to do my own book on the prophets. And but I did kind of the lectionary style. I was kind of a fool and just took little samples of things and tried to write a book about it. And it was a mess. And I couldn't get it to work, which is also a problem, trying to get it to work, right? And I was stalled. And I just had this whole text that I just sat with and realized I couldn't do anything with, and just put it aside. And a few years later, I was in Feldenkrais training in New York City, and I would always make my little pilgrimage of sorts to the Strand bookstore, and the very few street vendors that were left in that area. Used to be, as I understand, in the 60s and 70s, this whole streets were lined with book vendors, but only a few left. And I'd go to see what was there, because the Strand also had used books, and sometimes something interesting would show up. And I went this particular trip not having a lot of money. I was living pretty close to the ground in a sense, and very fortunate. I had a friend that was letting me stay on his floor in New York City. So my only expenses were eating, and I was able to eat same price, and by buying groceries and finding the less expensive places to buy a slice of pizza or whatever, and live on this friend's floor and do this training. But I went to Strand thinking I can't buy anything this time, cannot buy anything. But I found this very strange book, and I thought, it's got to be a bunch of garbage. Jacob's Wound, Homoerotic Narrative in the Literature of Ancient Israel by Theodore W. Jennings Jr. And I thought, this guy's probably some bozo who has never read these texts. And and put some book together that's going to be a problem, because I knew that there are homoerotic things in the texts, in the Hebrew text, in the Bible, but I couldn't get them. I couldn't make sense of some of them. I couldn't frame an argument that was going to make any sense. So I looked at this book, and it was a used book for $17.50. They were trying to sell it new for $34.95. And I thought, this is ridiculous, but I'm going to buy it just to be able to read it and prove this guy wrong, in a sense. And I bought it, and I think I put it on a credit card, and I bought it and brought it home and couldn't bear to read it for months. And I went back and tried to work with my text on the prophets, and was sitting not too far from the space, just in a chair over there looking out this window. And I was shocked when I just happened to open the book, and there opened this Jacob's wound, and I just opened to a random page and started reading, and it was talking about the very things that I found as problematic in the 1st Samuel that I had done some translating of, and it was talking about those things in an intelligent way. And I thought, oh my gosh, not only is this guy right, I think he's very brave to put this out there, because no other scholar was talking about these things. So I sat down and read the whole book and realized, some of my hunches were correct. And some of those things I thought were stumbling blocks within the text are indeed there. It's not just me reading them, and that the verbs point this particular way, that the writers of the Bible, in this case, a scholar or a writer I call X, many scholars call this person D, but I think it's definitely a different voice than the usual D, the Deuteronomist that wrote first. I say X wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel. In any case, I was reading this and realizing, well, maybe I can be as gutsy as this guy and put out a translation that puts forward, that puts forward what's actually there in the Hebrew that nobody seems to want to do. I'd read quite a bit of this Robert Alter's work over the years, and he seems to shy away from quite a few of these homoerotic themes that are sitting right there. So I decided, maybe I should just do this. And so I did, and couldn't get it to work, not all of it. So I decided I got to translate the whole thing, stop doing these chunks, do the whole thing of 1 Samuel, and did quite a bit of that. I had a bunch of frequent flyer miles built up from my Feldenkrais training in New York. And I used those to book a trip to France. And I lived in this nature's community down in the Mediterranean, and have to stay out of the sun quite a bit myself. So, and these are places where you have to be naked. That's the rule. It's naturist, you and nature. So I needed to find shelter during the high sun times, because my family needs to avoid the sun quite a bit. And so I would go into town, and the library was free and air conditioned, which was quite nice in these 95-degree days. And I would sit there and translate 1 Samuel. And it was quite a bit of work. And brought it home, read it through, and I realized there's still some things I couldn't make sense of. I was kind of lost and didn't know what to do about it. So I just put that in a box and put it aside. Did some other writing, wrote a book on yoga with some Vitality friends. And then finally, moment 9, getting to the end here, friends. The pandemic gave me this, a gift of time. Pandemic's given me quite a few gifts, maybe you too. But I decided it's time to return to that 1 Samuel. And I went through the text again in the Hebrew and improved my translation, but still had some problems. Couldn't make sense of what was going on in certain areas. But I was signed up for this NLP class with Larry Wells. And he said, does anyone in the group here have this experience with being stuck with something? And I said, oh yeah, I sure am. I'm stuck with this writing project. So he led me through this visualization. I thought it was silly at first. And I went and we had a break afterwards. I felt better at the end, but I didn't feel like I had any new ideas. And he was certainly not giving me ideas, right? He was leading me through something within myself. And we were on a break, and I went into the kitchen. This was all happening on Zoom because it was during the pandemic. And I went in the kitchen and made my afternoon coffee And in the midst of pouring the coffee in that other room, suddenly this flood of ideas came to me to resolve many of the problems in that text that I'd been working with for years. And I was like, my goodness, I went and wrote all these things down, was late getting back to class because I had all this flood of ideas, and then decided, okay, I've got to go back through all this again, was able to find ways to resolve the very tricky, clever problems of 1 Samuel. So another reason maybe nobody reads this text is because it is rather tricky. The author, the writer, is using the same kind of pun imagination that the prophets use. Like I said before, the prophets were essentially rap artists, very clever in what they do. And it started to realize that, well, this book, this translation of 1 Samuel eventually became The Naked Path of Prophet, an important book, I think, for our world. If we catch on to the style of this writer, the imagination of this writer that has, seems like the prophets are just operating in the background, and that David looks like David, and eventually Solomon in Kings, that they look like the most brilliant kings on earth, but they are made to look like fools if you read the whole book, which nobody does, right? Or very few people do. They look like complete fools compared to the prophets, who are these border crossing, wandering, mountain dwelling people that have swum away from the shipwreck of society, the misfits of society, living on the mountaintops and getting high on Yahweh, getting ecstatic with Yahweh. And I started to realize that Samuel, the namesake of the book of Samuel, this prophet that's on the mountaintop, trying to give these kings new ways of imagining life, that he's essentially set up as a rival for Moses. And that what Moses does, Samuel does, all back and forth, and that is in a sense that Samuel is set up as like the hero of the prophetic imagination. Rather interesting that Samuel's often in the background of most stories, and that Moses is set up as the par excellence priest. They even say he's the best prophet ever, though he has no rhymes and raps. But the priests hold up Moses as their hero. And here is this controversy within a religion then, right? Or the roots of this religion of Judaism. This controversy that most people, again, have chosen Moses, his vision, which is, I don't know, you have to decide, is it as clever as what Samuel is up to, and is relationship oriented with Yahweh? Because with Samuel, Yahweh is as close as a breath, as the wind, pervades you, is your life force. Whereas with Moses, you got to follow a long, hundreds of laws to be able to be in relationship with God, not Yahweh, not to be spoken out loud by priests. But the prophets were all about saying Yahweh out loud. It's the verb to be in Hebrew, rather clever. But I was fascinated that here is this controversy, right, within the Bible, right, one I hadn't caught on to, of the prophets and the priests offering very different visions for life, which is similar to the controversy in my own Christian tradition, right, of Paul offering this circular vision like the prophets of everyone being equal, and Peter, much like Moses, stuck with this hierarchical imagination that you got to do these things to be in relationship with Yahweh. Whereas Paul and the prophets and Jesus inviting this relationship just by being, by breathing. It's a fascinating controversy that many people just think, they're all talking about the same thing. They're not. The Bible is full of very different imaginations. So as I did my work and published The Naked Path of Prophet, I was like, oh my gosh, I should go back and check out those Genesis stories again, just to see if I've missed something. And did I ever? I thought I was going to be working with the stories for like a long weekend. And that long weekend turned out to be an entire year as I began to really listen again deeply. And how many times had I read these Genesis stories to be able to hear what's actually there and to start to realize, oh, this storyteller, not a writer, James, not a writer, this storyteller around probably a campfire uses this verb instead of this verb. Oh, and this verb has some interesting roots. Oh, oh, and then her stories got even funnier and more clever and more pun rich and flipped imaginations, much like Jesus's sayings and parables flip imaginations, much like the prophets' poems flip imaginations, that they're all playing in this much different way that doesn't have anything to do with law and with the priestly imagination of hierarchy, which I think is destroying us human beings. I mean, if you start to wonder with me about this prophetic imagination, this ecstatic prophetic imagination that's available to all of us, could it be the saving grace, for our world? And so I went back and took Art Dewey's advice. I made the best argument that I could. With the first edition of Sweet Lady J, I realized I was wrong. The second edition of Sweet Lady J, realized I was wrong. And now with this Wildly Sensual Yahweh, I think I'm at it, but people need to read it and check out the evidence themselves and start to wonder, could an even better argument be made? Right now, I don't think so, but maybe you'll find something. But you got to play in the sandbox of the Hebrew verbs. And I try to bring that forward, even for non-Hebrew readers in the text, to kind of say, notice this verb is used and not this one. Isn't that interesting? But in the next story, the author uses this one instead of this one. So there's that juxtaposition, a very clever juxtaposition oftentimes. So, I've been listening to these stories for decades now. If you go all the way back to my children's Bible, many decades, but, a couple very rich decades, 2 or 3 rich decades of really listening to these stories, and not just the lectionary cycle that most people get hung up on. And I invite you to begin to listen in a new way, in a way that could be important, I think, for human life on this planet. This planet's going to keep going on, whether human beings live on it or not. But our imagination as human beings, our ways of imagining reality, life, or call it whatever you want, are pretty limited with a hierarchical imagination where we're intent on destroying one another. But in a prophetic, ecstatic imagination that simply breathes in life and begins to realize that that is the relationship that sustains, that is the relationship that all of us share, that we're all co-equals in sharing that relationship with life, with the life force, with breath, with wind, with Yahweh, call it whatever you want, that could be a profound way of understanding life. And so I'm going to continue on. 2 editions of The Naked Path of Prophet are out now, the Wildly Sensual Yahweh being volume 0, the root, you might say, and some wild things about the Joseph story in that version, and how I see that linked to the prophetic imagination, which I don't think any scholar's talking about. I can't find any that are. And it's sitting right there for anybody to see. And then volume 1 Volume 1 of the Naked Path of Prophet series is translation of 1 Samuel through chapter 18. And I'm working on volume 2 now, which will take us through the end, at least as planned, the end of the first book of Samuel. And then I'll continue with the second book of Samuel, and then Kings and the prophets' poems, and return to some of Jesus' sayings so we can kind of see how they are all playing in the same sandbox. I'm not sure I'm bold enough to try to do what these wonderful scholars did with the authentic letters of Paul. I think that stands as quite possibly some of the best scholarship out there scripturally. And so I'm not going to touch Paul, at least I'm not planning on it. But I'd like to say just one thing about all this, just in conclusion, and why I'm doing this. And when I first decided to leave coaching and teaching, I had a number of friends send me notes. And especially when I explained why I was leaving, because I was leaving to found Vitality with some friends. And we wanted to find ways to share yoga and meditation and journaling and simple things like this Healing Touch, which was started by nurses in emergency room settings. And I said we're gonna found Vitality to offer these things, especially to make them affordable and accessible. And friends wrote me and said, you are going to lose your soul. You're going to lose your soul. And I said, well, and I would engage them in conversation. These were good friends. And I said, well, why do you think that? They said, oh, that yoga and meditation and stuff like that is very dangerous. And they quoted to me a particular bishop who was saying these things and getting other bishops to say these things. And I said to them, well, have you not read what Jesus had to say about that? I had no idea. I said, he's telling people to go out and heal each other. Take nothing with you for the journey, right? Trust that you can remind people that they're whole. That's what heal means, right? Remind people that they are whole and that they're living within a whole. Yahweh, the all, right? The universe. This is Jesus, what Jesus is up to. And I said this to them. They said, no, he didn't say anything like that. I said, well, it's in the Gospels. They were listening to an authority. My friends were listening to an authority who was commenting from his own vantage point, his own viewpoint, with his own agenda. They were listening to him instead of actually listening to the taproot of their own religion, Jesus. What's happening, right? What's happening? And the need for us to continue to listen to these texts and wonder about them, not just to take the, oh, well, it says this and therefore I should just do this, to wonder about them, to realize that they're in the Bible is in conversation. The Bible is a conversation of many different camps having a conversation together. And so if we're wise readers, we need to kind of wonder, oh, this camp's saying this over here in the Bible. This camp's saying this. What is the wiser path? Is it one of these two camps? Or is there another way? Is there a third way that's being invited? That's what needs to begin to happen, right? We need to allow ourselves to wake up and maybe, yeah, we can study more scripture. Maybe that's what's needed, right? Or maybe we can begin to have more naked experiences of the wind. Whether you choose to take your clothes off or not is not the question. But to trust that the wind alone, the breath alone, might awaken if we sit long enough and begin to feel, right? Feel the wind, the life force, what the ancients called Yahweh, which no priest wants us to say out loud anymore. Why? Try it. Say Yahweh. Yahweh. What does it make you do? It makes you breathe. Yahweh. Almost sounds like the wind. Yahweh. Sounds like the breath, right? It's fascinating to me too, is even the most, I used to belong to a pretty liberal Catholic church that I felt the need to swim away from, that even that church has issues with reading the texts carefully, right? It's not just, churches that are advocating that the results of the January 6th invasion of the Capitol is biblically wise. It's not just these, what I would call, patriotic, maybe very conservative churches that are having problems with reading scripture. It's even my own home church is having trouble with wanting to read what's there, even afraid of what's there in the Bible. But, if we began to listen to what some of these more ancient voices are inviting, what's the big root of Jesus's teaching, but to love, and to not just love your family, that's nice, or to love your friends, that's nice, or to love your neighbor, maybe that's nice, but to love one's enemies, to love the person in that church that you don't agree with at all, whether it's your church or another church, to find a way to love every human being. Can we do that? And can you begin to see how, if we're all breathing that same Yahweh, that we're all equal in this journey together as human beings? We all wear the same crown. Mine doesn't have much hair left on it, right? We all wear the same crown. We all have the same status of value as a human being, a valued human being, that we all are breathing this Yahweh together, that Yahweh imbues us with life. if that's what we begin to return to, ah, maybe we have a chance. Let's find out.